So I know it's been a long day. We're probably all rather tired. I'm going to edit my comments a little because if I give you the full 30 minutes, you're going to be struggling to get to the bar. I appreciate that. Let's just talk about human risk for a minute and how we engage with what is really an existential threat to the planet. But I'm going to address that existential threat with the help of some friends, including a fish, a pack animal, and a stroppy teenager. I'm also going to ask you to engage in a couple of response exercises. You'd expect me as a behavioral scientist of 20 years to want to experiment with this wonderful captive audience I have here. So I see a few people are running away already. I don't blame you. Let's see about human engagement with risk. First of all, a very brief social history, and rather controversially, I'm going to suggest that we actually have a bit of a loop in the history here. So first of all, here are our friends rushing around the landscape in a primitive society, and pretty much to them, when something happens, it is the gods, it's fate, it's misfortune, and we can't do anything about it. Stick it on a timeline, and we can see that our engagement with risk, our ability, our capacity to see and to manage risk has increased. So we have, just on a very loose timeline here, I'm not being very academically specific, early civilizations, so the dawn of engineering, and then Mr. Lloyd's coffee house in the City of London allowed us to price risk and sell it onwards. Then, of course, risk cut loose into derivative markets, and that ended well, didn't it? And finally, we're in what's now called the Risk Society. For anyone interested, Ulrich Beck, the Risk Society, has a strong claim to be possibly the most boring textbook ever written. So I'm going to summarize it in a couple of seconds here. Essentially, you choose for yourself the degree of risk that you take on in your life. So we're now in this postmodern era. Unfortunately, the existential challenge of the planet being on fire is tending to tip us back into this rather prehistoric kind of crouch position. It's fate, there's nothing we can do about it. And actually, for all of our risk management, we're pretty stuck. So the event of this, which is an existential catastrophe, is answered by this, which is 80 sheets of paper. Are we actually going to deal with the one through the leverage of the other? I'm going to suggest controversially, and you can probably see where I'm going here, no is the answer. And just to quote, to stand on the shoulders of a couple of giants for a second, risk is an invented concept, blah, 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 or rather more concisely, George Box says all models are wrong, but some are useful. Now, I make it my business to challenge the models that are wrong and to look for the ones that are useful, but in a very particular way, which I'd like to share with you over the next 20 minutes or so, if time allows. How do we humans deal with new risk information? Well, a very good experiment, which you can perhaps play at home, is to consider what sort of animal are you in response to the event of a sudden change of circumstances. So lots of behavioral experiments around this, but here's a very simple one. I'm going to put a dog in a box and invite you to consider which of these animals are you in the changing situation. So we have a very simple, I have to say, entirely humane experiment, which is to put a bunch of different animals in a cardboard box. As we look at each of these, I'd like you to think which demeanor of which animal most resembles your firm in engaging with the risk to the planet. If you are interested, by the way, it's the science of subjective situational response, but I'm not going to use any jargon much this afternoon. So which of these most feels like you? Here's our box. Here's our dog. I'm going to suggest, and I've prepared a few answers only because I think you'll probably work this out for yourself, pretty much fatalistic. Now, that other great domestic favorite, the cat, on the other hand, has an entirely different response. Arguably this. Let's just put a few other things in the box. Here's a child. I know it is humane, honest, I promise. The child's response is perhaps a little bit more reflective, maybe existential. A bird, pretty straightforward. And finally, my personal favorite of the experimental group is the hamster, for whom the box itself represents a new opportunity rather than existential risk. So, through the simple medium of a box test, we very quickly get into this space that I'm going to call, ignoring the science names completely, what actually happens. And I think we can briefly introduce the what actually happens effect, because you're going to recognize there's a repeating cycle here. And I'm going to suggest, probably not very controversially, in line with our excellent friend who's just hot-footed back from COP, that we're not doing a very good job. So the what actually happens effect pops up in all kinds of situations. I'm just going to highlight half a dozen really, really quickly. I'm going to turn around because it's just easy for me to read the screen. Also, check you're still awake. And so, mobility, we invented all these wonderful gadgets for travel, the railway, the automobile, the aeroplane, and almost immediately, or at least within a period of 100 years or so, stuff started to go wrong. So we had maintenance failures, gridlock, and the repurposing as a weapon of a previously peaceful invention. Let's look at communications. What could possibly go wrong with giving everyone the freedom to communicate globally? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. Virtual bullying, identity theft, strong evidence that mobile phones are a major migration vector. And finally, the extreme selfie. What could possibly go wrong? Finally, then, financial markets. So we would have this rooted belief that we're trading in fundamental self-interest, homo economicus, you have to be an economist. Here's our friend Adam Smith, setting it out in case you've not read him recently. Pretty obviously, stuff goes wrong. Actually, this third picture I had the most trouble with because there are so many crypto crashes, I actually didn't know which one to choose. FTX, did you know they approved their expenses by emoji, so I couldn't resist. Hands up to Paul for mentioning that one. So look, what actually happens, some unhelpful conclusions. Where we try to do public policy, stuff goes wrong. And I'm not saying it is inevitable that stuff goes wrong, but we fail to foresee consequences because we don't sufficiently study human behavior, which is, of course, good news for me because that's what I do. So, substance abuse, okay, let's ban them. What could go wrong with that? Gangster economy. Bacterial infections, what could possibly go wrong with that? Overuse of antibiotics, MRSA-resistant bacteria. Economy stuck, how can we kickstart it? I know, let's print some more money or do quantitative easing or whatever it's fashionably called these days. What could the possible foreseeable outcomes of that be? So similarly, when we have a global problem of the planet on fire, we need to consider whether our controlled interventions are up to it. With all due respect to our colleague from COP27, sorry, we haven't met before, but I'm going to insult you already. My general sense is that commitments to, I know that was last year, but it's the same thing, right? Phasing down, what the hell does that mean? Let's be honest. Financializing risk, I'm now going to insult all of you. I'm an equal opportunities offender. I'm going to suggest that that's not kind of working either. What on earth is a carbon derivative? What on earth is a carbon crypto exchange? What actual difference is that making to save the planet? Even the stuff we have got that we've been talking about all day, ESG reporting standards, I have noted from working with bankers, which I'll tell you about in a second, is already generating these secondary, let's call them gaming effects. I don't propose to explain what I mean by framework arbitraging. I'm sure you're all grown up enough to understand where we're going with that. Right. Why do I research any of this? Well, I've been doing this now for sort of 20 plus years on both sides of the conversation, both the producers and the regulators. And I've come to the not very surprising conclusion that what the rules and the models say is not the same as what real people really do. To just give you a simple example, it's pretty obviously the bite back effect in action. Therefore, as a research scientist, you would expect me to examine what explains the difference. And I'm going to attempt to do that in about 10 minutes to give you time to go to the bar. So, actually, why don't I summarize what I'm going to say? So if you do need to run to the bar now, here's your opportunity at the end of this slide. We underestimate the power of nature because we consistently overestimate our own skill in framing problems. We underestimate our own and others' collective resolve to engage in problems. We mispredict how people will respond by assuming that they're rational, the number one mistake, by not understanding or engaging with the bias effects that affect them, and by not foreseeing the gaming responses that occur. Now, how does this affect what we're trying to do today? Well, fantastically, in the panel session just now, we talked about a common language, a collaboration, why you're doing what you're doing, and how credible is your response. That's what I propose to talk about for the next sort of 15 minutes or so, if time allows. I'm just going to check my timeline. Yeah, it's good, we can make it. So, let's talk about the 225 documented bias effects. No, let's not do that. Let's do this one, it's a whole lot simpler. I'd like you to meet my fish. I'm a bit of a fish fan. So much so, rather sadly, that I've named my fish Tim and Tom. So just so you know, one of my goldfish is Tim and the other one is Tom. Just put your hand up if you would like to guess that Tom is the fish on the right. Do you think Tom is the fish on the right? Okay. And hands up if you think that Tim is the fish on the left. I know it's the same question. Okay. What if I were to tell you that 85% of the population of the planet would tell you that Tom is the fish on the right? Now, the correct answer to the question actually is not just to acquiesce and put a hand up, it's to say, Roger, what on earth are you on about? How can I possibly know your goldfish naming habits? Full disclosure, I don't own any goldfish. What I did was trigger a thing called confirmation bias, which gave you the answer to a question to which I knew to 100% certainty you could not possibly know the answer. So Tim is very often the little fish in the UK because of Tiny Tim, the Christmas character. Tom equally because of Big Tom, and so on. So what if I tell you that 7 out of 8 people would give the answer that those brave enough to put their hand up just gave? We can trigger biases, you know, like falling off a log. So why not do we engage with biases a little more energetically? The big bias that we face in saving the planet is this one. And again, from that enormous wheel, I'll very happily talk about other biases over a drink later, but this is the one that really matters. I put the nerd definition up there, but let me put a rather straightforward one up instead. Yeah, we used it up. Too late, hey? Well, you know, too late. Done it. What can we do? And we see this effect over and over and over again. So what comfort should I have that behavior is going to change? Well, what does all this have to do with the responsible asset owners? To say, well, you're a lot better at a starting point than the irresponsible asset owners, which is everybody else. So that's a good one. Let's quickly talk about your culture of risk reporting. Broadly speaking, there are 3 ways in to doing your risk. And by the way, by that I mean ESG reporting, engagement, and so on. I wonder again, which one of these categories might you think that you fall into? Here's the first one, which is quite prevalent. To get the result we need, even if that means gaming the system. Or because it's the correct thing to do, by which I mean technically correct thing to do. Or, and I've highlighted it in green, there's a bit of a hint here, because it matters most for our collective future. Now, you can have mixtures of any 2 of the 3, but you can't have all 3. They're mutually contradictory. So we have been here before, and I just want to share with you for a couple of minutes the research that I was doing as a wet behind the ears PhDist in the early noughties. The global financial crisis, some of us still remember back in 2007-8, actually could teach us about where our engagement is going wrong. So let me give you some bad bankers for a couple of minutes. Remember them? Whatever happened to them? Here they are. Imagine that the year is 2006. These are, just to be clear, direct quotes from chief executives, finance directors, and chief risk officers in investment banks in the square mile of London in the summer of 2006. Remember that wonderful summer before all the wheels fell off. So just 3 quotes to share with you. I'm going to pause. You can read it while I have a sip of water. Okay, let's do another one. Quite a startling image, isn't it? Let's do banker number 2. Can I just say these are all real people on condition of anonymity, okay? So under research control conditions, they are absolute. I could name them, but obviously I can't. They're still out there. Finally. Which was dark humor, surely. Okay. My point is quite simply, sounds familiar? You know, any resonance with what we're trying to do with ESG? Any sort of attitude shift? Possibly not. Right, let's quickly talk about experts and risk. The first problem I have with the R word, risk, is that it means entirely different things to different people, depending on who you're asking. The most basic problem with it is between the public sector, so this is public sector risk management, stopping the bad stuff. And the private sector, this is private sector risk management, chasing profit opportunities, the balance of hazard and opportunity, if you want to be technical. Any actuaries in the room? Do we have any actuaries present? That's good, because I'm about to insult the profession of actuaries. A quick way to illustrate this is our new friend, the actuary, who's not here, goes on holiday with the lovely kids. It's a gender-neutral actuary. I hope you saw what I did there. The actuary goes on holiday, and on the first day of the lovely family holiday, the kids look out of the hotel window, and this is the scene that the children see. The actuary looks out at the same window at the same instant at the same scene and sees it like this. Now, to be clear, this is a perfect audit of that scene. It's the same number of towels, umbrellas, children, beach balls, and all the rest of it. Would anyone like to argue that this is reality, that this is what actually happened on the hotel lawn that day? I'm thinking probably not. We know intuitively it's a bit more like this. This is what actually happened. And yet the entire financial industry seems to be geared to reporting this kind of pattern rather than what actually happened. So what do experts do wrong? Well, an expert, I won't spool through all the detail, but basically if you ask an expert what the weather is, he'll hand you a barograph rather than put his head out of the window and observe whether it's raining or not. So experts very often are so busy quantifying stuff like the towels on the hotel lawn that they forget to tell us what's actually happening, particularly in human terms. By the way, I love that phrase, normal people. That's the phrase that behavioral science uses for people who are not behavioral scientists. So good, or indeed risk managers. Right, so can we not do stuff that provokes disengaged behavior? Can we not compile reports in such a way that they put people off? Remember our old friend, the dog in the box. So can we better design ESG controls and reporting information and comms to make stuff work in a way that people want to engage with it rather than as a stick to beat them with? So I'm just going to walk about again a bit because it's more fun. Problems of control design, problems of regulatory capture is the phrase that academics use when they say, when they mean lobbying interests have captured the debate. So successful lobbying of regulatory process is regulatory capture. Quick problems of control design. Why do operational risk controls fail? Well, to sum it up in one picture, what am I supposed to do in response to this object? Let's say I'm at that conference, I've got a lit cigarette in my hand. Do I put it out? Do I rest my cigarette on this convenient gadget while I go and get another beer? What am I supposed to do? And you might say, well, we can see that some controls are self-evidently stupid. Okay, what could possibly be wrong with that? Well, here's a real example. Are you a terrorist? Yes or no? Now, all I can say with certainty is that I've never sat next to anyone who's ticked yes on the flight to America. Does that make it a well-designed control? No, I understand the legal principle, but let's call it what it is. It's a rubbish-looking control design. So there are 4 myths of control design which we build, sadly, into ESG without realizing. Let me just blow up each of those myths in turn. More rules equals tighter control. Targets improve behavior. A thorough risk plan will keep us safe. And systemic risk is control. And I'm willing to bet, and forgive my rudeness, I have not sat through all the sessions today, or I have sat through 4 of them. I'm pretty much getting signals that people are buying into these. So I'd like to just knock them over before you go off for tea. First off, let's talk about our old friend Tacitus from the Roman era. The more rotten the governance, the more numerous the laws. So the weaker the government, the more it's inclined to scattergun regulation around. Charles Goodhart from London School of Economics, when an indicator is adopted for the purpose of a policy, it ceases to be a valid measure. We're going to come back to him in a couple of minutes to see what we can do about that. Lee Clark from Berkeley, California. Many control plans are fantasy documents. He did a big study of crisis management plans and found that more than half of them don't work in organizations which had actually deployed those plans in response to an event. And finally, that great academic John Lennon, life is what happens while you're making other plans. We kind of know from the what actually happens effect. So quickly on the problem of regulatory capture, vested interests. Here's one of our bad banker friends. Dark, isn't it? How many of our banker friends do we know who think like that still, even after a crisis and another crisis? So people get skeptical. People, the public, the normal people, remember that? They get skeptical when they observe behavior like this and circumstances like this. They are naturally skeptical, and why wouldn't they be? You have an institution that outlives the regulator, whose economic strength is greater than that of the nation that is trying to regulate it, that has enormous reach and can yank its workforce out of one jurisdiction and into another with impunity, where the provider's product is virtual, opaque, where the skills can be replicated in other jurisdictions. Hey, guess what? Banking ticks all of those. I wonder if asset management does as well. You might want to have a think about that. What should we do then? Well, the good news is, if, like me, you study the behavioral science stuff, you'll find that there are some people who've been working on this for an awfully long time. You might think that conduct regulation is a UK thing or your US thing. Maybe if you're active in Singapore, it's a Singapore thing. Nope. The Dutch. We got any Dutch people in the room? Oh, right. The Dutch have been doing this since 1993, using behavioral research to predict response to new controls, whether it's, dogs making a mess in the park, how to ride your bicycle better, or whatever. The Dutch have been doing this for a long, long time. Here's the model they came up with, and no, I'm not going to explain it fully, just to highlight two things. Strongly legitimate regulators, that is, where there's a robust dialogue between the regulator and the providers, get public support and get things done. Where there's a lot of disagreement between experts, we heard the phrase social license mentioned in one of the previous panels. Where that is weak, public distrust mobilizes, the regulator loses traction, and the project stalls. Just leave that one for you to think about in the ESG space. So, 3 steps briefly in the final 5 minutes to fixing the problem. We need to make it easier for everyone, that's just ordinary people among our workforce and the public and families, to buy into being ESG positive, not to make it complicated and technical, to disengage people from the conversation. So, 3 steps which I'll just illustrate one at a time. Start a better conversation, choose indicators that tell a story. We are human creatures who love narrative, storytelling. We explain things in terms of anecdotes and stories. And finally, think in more productive ways. So remember our old friend, the actuary, and their children at the hotel. Well, this is the soup that the actuary's children are eating. Meanwhile, this is the soup that the actuary is eating. We have a problem with that, yes? Can we actually look on more nuance and understand that people behave as they behave, that behavior is much more random and complex than the accounting tendency. We're in a law firm today, right? So I can joke about accountants too. Than the accounting tendency would have us believe. And I did train as an accountant, so apologies to any accountants in the room. Let's improve indicators. And for this, we need to go back to our friends Tacitus and Professor Goodhart. Turns out Tacitus was actually rather good at what we now call observational behavioral science. The fact of him being an ancient Roman didn't mean he couldn't think carefully. So let's call him what he is, a behavioral scientist. The danger is we confuse outputs with outcomes, that weak institutions hide behind big initiatives. Here's our compliance manual that nobody ever reads, but look how thick it is. Detailed checklists suppress critical thinking, personal responsibility, and discourage people from learning. So can we not report on the resources that we're throwing at the problem? Can we instead please report on what resulted and what changed, and fixate relentlessly on outcomes rather than inputs? Over to Professor Goodhart. Narrow quantitative targets induce gaming. I feel I probably need to say that a few times to get the full sense of it across. Or in simple terms, what's measured is what matters. I love this phrase used by McKinsey in the study called How Financial Models Shape Markets. Management information all too often is an engine, not a camera. It is not simply photographing what's going on, it is changing behavior, and people are gaming their behaviors in order to make the targets. So we need to anticipate that effect and design it out and observe relentlessly what actually happens, to be objective, to be unobtrusive, to just quietly see what's changing rather than use the indicators themselves as some kind of clumsy lever. So if you want to change behavior, two seriously important factors. I could do an hour on this, I frequently do, but let's just do 10 seconds on each. Psychological safety, you may have heard of. Here is the technical definition from Harvard, which is currently being worked on. I'll just let you read that. But again, rather than leave you with the language, let me leave you with an image of psychological safety. Please, by the way, I'm not saying actually do this. This is just a mental picture. I'm not saying go crowd surfing. I'm saying this is how it feels to have psychological safety in the organization. The other big indicator is cognitive diversity. Here's a definition again. It's, I appreciate, a real abstraction. So let me try and give you a bit of a concrete explanation. I want you to imagine that that white object is a three-dimensional thing hanging in space, so that I'm wandering around it, changing the color of the torch as I walk around it. You can see with a little bit of mental effort, I was going to bring one with me, but this is a very large hall. So let's just say I've got a green torch here, it's a square. I've got a blue torch there, it's a triangle, and so on. The shape of the problem depends on your perception of it, your angle of approach, and indeed the experience that you bring to it. So these two indicators, where they are present, this is the asset management takeaway, will give you these outturns to a high degree of reliability: staff retention, problem solving, innovating, product resilience, and guess what? Customers stay longer, which equals more funds under management, yeah? Or tell me I'm wrong. Right, got a couple of minutes before we finish, so I'm going to use you for another experiment. Can you get yourself into working pairs, please? So find somebody who is within your eye line and say hello to them. I know it's a little bit like a Holy Communion or something. Introduce yourself to a person who is close to you. Okay. Right, settle down, class. We've only got a minute. All right. You can do the talking again in just a second when I've told you what to talk about. I want you to try with your new best friend who you've just met this quick experiment and see how it goes. Explain to that person what work you do as if they were an intelligent 12-year-old. Go now. Haven't quite finished. You're doing well. I'm just 12. Okay, look, I know you want to hit the bar and you're probably having fun with your new 12-year-old friend. Let me rope this together again so we can take something useful away from the session. What just happened? Paul knows. What just happened is, through the medium of this simple question. By the way, I have tried the Bank of England test in derivatives trading floors, you know, in bear pits with traders, and saying, tell me about your social purpose. And guess what happens to me when I ask that question on a trading floor? The most polite response I get is normally two words of Anglo-Saxon. I've had physical responses, threats of violence. So what you have just done with the talk to a 12-year-old is exactly the same thing. So with all respect and kudos to Paul, who is with us, without realizing it, you've had a conversation about finding your social purpose. I just wrapped it up in a question about explaining to an intelligent child. It's the same thing. If you have access to a junior member of the family who you can try it on, give it a go. They have short attention spans, but a lot of persistence with a question if you're not giving them a straight answer. That's the point. Intuitively, we already know what our social, and I grilled a couple of people in the front row mercilessly because they were talking about boards of directors and governance and, you know, what do you actually do? What is the result of what you do that makes the world in any way different? If you have not thought about that in a way you can explain to a child, I'd suggest you're not doing your job in the ESG space. So this approach helps us to engage, to behave well. It is absolutely pro-ESG for the reason just given, adds business value, what's not to like as an asset manager, and it's a great way to start improving the ESG conversation sector-wide. Now, people are asking me all the time in banking, how can we sharpen our insights into human factor risk? Well, I ask it a bit more basically than that, but how do we score this thing called conduct, social engagement? You know, well, it's really about that. How are we helping the markets, our colleagues, the world generally? If you want more specific advice, and inevitably I'm going to say somebody called Roger Miles has written a book about it, which has actually been specifically endorsed by the FCA, the Fed in the US, and the Singapore Monetary Authority. So that might suggest that the research is landing quite well with those regulators. If you have a more general interest in diverse thinking and psychological safety to encourage the conversation, I really should be on a commission from the publishers at this point, but I'm not. I'm genuinely saying these are the 3 best books I've read on those subjects. So, engagement and reporting, improving your diversity of thinking, improving your psychological safety. You've probably had plenty of me and you're dying to get to the bar. We've got 1 minute for questions. How's that?
No, I don't know. I'm not sure we were planning any questions, but does anybody have any questions while you have this man's attention? Any quick questions before we say goodbye? I think you're going to be set free. I think that's it. You've actually answered everybody's question.
I've answered all your questions.
A huge round of applause again, please, for Roger Miles. Putting together an event like this is always a bit of a challenge, particularly when it comes to the agenda, because you've got to cover all the subjects, but you want them to be interesting, you want to get the right speakers. I think we've had a fantastic collection of people here today, and you've made it also very worthwhile. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope we see you at another RAO conference soon. Thank you.